Once again, the familiar words of Micah 6:8, calling us to love mercy, to do the work of justice, and to walk humbly. Ancient good words that are continually good for us to focus on and work on in our daily lives. Good morning. It's now been 20 weeks since we were able to gather and worship together in this room. 20 weeks. I was just thinking this week about the feeling I had back in March when hypothetically it was said that there's a possibility that we might not be able to gather for Easter. Do you remember that? We might not be able to gather for corporate worship on Easter Sunday, and that now seems so long ago. We continue to take every day as it comes, each week, cultivating patience, and yet still, even though we can't come to church in the building and meet together, the church has not stopped being the church. And so good morning as we continue in our series, The Long and Winding Ancient Road Less Traveled. Week number 5, we're almost done. Looking at these 6 different aspects of monastic life and what they might teach us. Ancient ways of being the people of God in our day. Today, walking humbly. Humility is a very important virtue to the Benedictines. It's a very important virtue for the Christian. The next song has the line in it about reaching for the highest goal. A little bit of an oxymoron on a week focusing on humility. Reaching for the highest goal. And so, let us continue in worship this morning, focusing on the ancient practice of humility.
In the stillness you are there.
Paul writes in Philippians 2, if you have any encouragement at all from being united with Christ, if you have any comfort from his love, any common sharing in the Spirit, any tenderness and compassion, then make my joy complete. By being like-minded, by having the same love, being one in the Spirit, being of one mind. And do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you looking to the interests of others. O Spirit of God, O God of Jacob, come, make us humble. Amen. I think it's obvious why that song got picked. The opening lines, we bow our hearts, we bend our knees, O Spirit, come make us humble. But a fun little serendipity that I didn't even realize until we were recording this with Dean and Emma. That line in the chorus that says, "Let us be a generation that seeks your face, O God of Jacob." And as soon as they were singing it, I realized that's kind of a fun little segue into this message on humility, because Benedict devotes an entire chapter in his rule to humility. And in it, he walks through 12 rungs of a ladder he calls the ladder of humility. And so, O God of Jacob, indeed, come, make us humble. Take us back to our forefather Jacob. There's actually a little oxymoron going on there, because Benedict is taking us back to Jacob's dream, in which he has this ladder, right? I remember as a kid singing the song, "We are climbing Jacob's ladder. Every rung goes higher, higher." And in this desire to go higher and higher and get to the highest place, Benedict says, if we want to reach the highest summit of humility, isn't that an oxymoron? The highest summit of humility. Well, I actually would like that. I'd like that for myself. That's the spirit of where we're going today. He says if we want to reach that highest summit, then we've got to set that ladder on which Jacob in a dream saw a ladder of humility. We're in week 5 of this series, The Long and Winding Ancient Road Less Traveled, where we began with Jeremiah's words, "Stand at the crossroads and look. Ask for the ancient paths. Ask where the good and godly way is, and then walk in it, and you'll find rest for your souls." But you keep replying, "No, that's not the road we want." And so for 6 weeks, I keep coming back to you and just laying this ancient road before us. We looked at the Benedictine commitment to solitude and silence. We looked at the vow of stability that Benedictine monastics make, vowing themselves to one specific community to live their lives for the rest of their lives. We looked at the monastic daily rhythm of prayer. Last time we looked at this Benedictine motto of ora et labora, that yes, prayer, but also labor. And that Benedictine is very practical in calling monks to not just pray throughout the day and night, but to have daily manual tasks that they do. This morning, I want to look at the Benedictine focus of humility. The Christian virtue of being humble, the call that we have as Christians, with Jesus as our model and example, to be humble. The word humility comes from the word humus, means of the earth. Now that is different than hummus. Hummus is actually from the Arabic for chickpea, but if you ask me, it tastes like dirt, so I think maybe they are related. But humus versus hummus, humility, of the earth. This is practical groundedness. I've said several times in this series that I'm not calling us to this higher level of spirituality, looking at these monks and these nuns as holy spiritual people. Indeed they are, but they are very practical, rooted human beings. As I mentioned, chapter 7 in the Rule, it's actually the longest chapter in the Rule, this one devoted to humility. It's simply entitled Humility. And it made me kind of think of Psalm 119. You're familiar with that psalm? It's that one that we get in the middle of the Bible and it takes up several pages, long. Similarly here, there's 70 some chapters to Benedict's Rule, but chapter 7 is the longest one. It actually comprises about 8% of the entire Rule, devoted to these 12 steps on the ladder of humility. Philippians 2 tells us that our attitude should be like Christ Jesus, and Paul says to do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, we ought to value others above ourselves. The Message says, don't push your way to the front. Put yourself aside. That's the focus for this morning. Take us to C.S. Lewis in his classic work, Mere Christianity. He has the entire 8th chapter entitled The Great Sin. Lewis writes, there's one vice of which no one in the world is free. One vice which everyone in the world loathes when they see it in someone else, and of which hardly any people ever imagine that they are guilty themselves. And he is speaking of the vice, the sin, the great sin of pride or self-conceit. He says unchastity, anger, greed, drunkenness, and all of that are mere flea bites in comparison. He says that pride leads to every other vice. He says that pride is a spiritual cancer. It eats up the very possibility of love, contentment, or even common sense. Each person's pride, he says, here's the problem. Each person's pride is in competition with everyone else's pride. And so Lewis writes, if anyone would like to acquire humility, I think, tell you the first step. The first step, it's kind of funny. Benedict's going to have 12 steps. Lewis starts us off by telling, I think I can tell you the first one. Benedict's will be different, but Lewis's first step is to realize that one is proud. And a biggish step too, he says. At least nothing whatever can be done before that step. If you think that you are not conceited or proud, it means you are very conceited indeed. Which is why Columbus Stewart wrote, humility requires radical self-honesty. Joan Chittister, I've quoted her throughout this series. She's a contemporary Benedictine nun. And she writes of this in commenting on Benedict's 7th chapter. She opens with this paragraph, if the modern age has lost anything that needs to be rediscovered, if the Western world has denied anything that needs to be owned, if individuals have rejected anything that needs to be professed again, if the preservation of the globe in the 21st century requires anything of the past at all, it may well be the commitment of the Rule of Benedict to humility. And so for a few moments here, I'd just like to walk through. I'm not going to read all of Benedict's rule here, but the 12 steps. And some of them are, you got to kind of filter them through 6th century, different eyes, different lenses, but try to get the spirit of what Benedict is calling the brothers to. But some of them are, I don't think need much commentary or translation. He says that the first step of the ladder is that we keep the fear or reverence of God ever before our eyes. That we recall that we are always seen by God. He even goes on to say that our actions everywhere are in God's sight and are reported by angels every hour. One commentator I was reading wrote, yikes, the angels are reporting on us every hour? That's not a very comforting thought. And yet, the writer says, I think we can see what Benedict is getting at. It's not unlike the 139th Psalm that says, where can I go from your spirit? And that is supposed to bring comfort to us, that no matter where we go, God will always be with us. But I think what Benedict is driving at, and I would agree, is that the first step toward humility is to realize that God is always watching us. This same writer that I just quoted goes on to say, we all know that people behave abysmally in anonymous situations. And so humility demands situational consistency, even when we are alone. I read a definition one time of who we are when no one's looking. Are we the same people? Because when we think that no one's looking, then we can just kind of go off the rails. But if we're aware, if we cultivate a constant awareness that God is aware, That, Benedict says, is the first step. The second step of the ladder, he says, is that we would love not our own will, nor take pleasures in the satisfaction of our own desires. Rather, we would imitate that saying of the Lord when Jesus said, I have come not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me. And so we cultivate an awareness and a reverence of God. We then sacrifice our will. We say, not my will, but yours be done. And then Benedict gets very practical in community living. And I think to some of in our contemporary ears, this can sound potentially abusive, which it is. So I put it in context. But the third step of the ladder is to submit to the abbot or prioress in all obedience. And we'll come back to this idea of submission a little bit later. But the Benedictine vow of obedience, the virtue of submission and obeying, then will cultivate humility. Fourth step of the ladder is that in this obedience, under difficult, unfavorable, or even unjust conditions, our hearts quietly embrace suffering and endure it without weakening or seeking escape. Chittister puts that up against our modern era and our modern mindset where she writes that the goal of the 21st century is to cure all diseases, order all inefficiency, topple all obstacles, end all stress, and prescribe immediate panaceas. We wait for nothing, put up with little, and abide less and react with fury at irritations. True? And so the fourth step of the ladder is to not only, step 3 was to submit to the elders, but step 4 is to submit to circumstances. Step 5 is then also to not conceal from the abbot or prioress any sinful thoughts entering our hearts, or any wrongs committed in secret, but rather confesses them humbly. That's indeed a quite foreign practice for us, the practice of confession. We keep much in secret. Now, this one writer that I forgot to go back and look to see who it was, but I was reading this commentary on the ladder from one writer, and they say, I'm sure alarm bells are going off about how abusive this might be, but transparency, authenticity, and confession do seem critical in cultivating humility, no? At the very least, at least an honest self-accounting. Confession, admitting our weaknesses, admitting our sinful thoughts. The confession where we confess doing the things that we ought not to do and not doing the things that we ought to do. Step 6 in Benedict's ladder is that we're content with the lowest and most menial treatment, and that we regard ourselves as poor and worthless workers in whatever tasks we are given. Again, those are harsh words. Thinking of worthlessness, we think of the need to have a sense of self-esteem. And so I would argue the point is not this worm theology, is to just know how worthless someone is. That's another step on the ladder of humility. But to, though, go against the sense of striving and putting ourselves first, and to be content with menial tasks. That kind of goes into play with last week's idea of work and labor. But to be content with lower position, and to regard ourselves not as number one, looking out for number one, but to think of others as higher than us. Similarly, then, step 7 says to not only admit with our tongues, but also be convinced in our hearts that we are, these are Benedict's harsh words of the 6th century, but inferior to all and of less value. I hope and please that you can filter through the spirit of what's going on here. My argument here is to not look into this camera lens and look out at you there and say, you are not valuable, that you are of less value, and that you are inferior to all. To find a way to paraphrase that in a sense of fostering a spirit of humility, knowing that no, you are worthy of all, that in the deep love of God and the value that God has for you. Remember, think of the birds, think of the lilies of the field. Are you not much more valuable than they? But then to take that and be convinced of ourselves that we don't have to be positioning ourselves to a higher sense of value. The issue here seems to be about being humble in heart and not just in speech. So it's not just the tongue, but to also just have a true attitude in our heart that we are not number one. This writer said a lot of people pretend to be humble verbally. Benedict wants it to go deep. The 8th step has to do with obedience, and to do only what is endorsed by the common rule of the monastery and the example set by the abbot or prioress. I would like to filter that through the lens here of Jeremiah 6:16. Joan Chittister says, stay in the stream of life. Learn from what is learned before us. Value the truths taught by others. Seek out wisdom. Do not make the mistake of being our own blind guides. Jeremiah says, stand at the crossroads. Look around and ask where the ancient way is. Benedict says, do only what is endorsed by the common rule of the monastery. Don't go always running off thinking that you know better, that you have a better way. 9th step, control one's tongue and remain silent. We talked a little bit of this in the first week when we talked about silence and solitude. It's not just about silence for silence's sake, and it's not just about the quietness of no noise. That is a part of it. But there is also the wisdom in being silent, less words, where Jesus says that, we need less words in prayer, but in community, to not always just have to have something to say. People who are full of themselves do like to hear themselves talk, yes? No? But we are not as smart or as interesting as we would like to believe. The same author. So perhaps we should have less talking and more listening. Listening to others is an expression of humility. Listening is a form of hospitality, which is going to be our final topic next week, Benedictine hospitality. And so you can see how silence and humility and hospitality and life in community all begin to fit together. Joan Chittister says, when arrogance erupts everywhere, and is it not erupting around us everywhere? When arrogance erupts anywhere, it erupts invariably in speech. Our opinions become the rule, our ideas become the goal, our judgments become the norm, and our word becomes the last word, the only word. And Benedict says over and over, listen, learn, and be open to the other. As we wind down here, things get maybe a little less relevant sounding and a little odd. Benedict's 10th step is to not be given to ready laughter, which I find a little troublesome, so I have to stop and sit back that. But if I'm going to listen before, as Benedict, and learn to listen and be open to the other, I've got to be open to what Benedict's trying to say here. Are we not supposed to laugh? Joan Chittister says, well, everything we laugh at is not funny. And that I would agree with. And so when we get to the 11th step, it's kind of, we talked about silence, and now Benedict says the 11th step is to speak gently and without laughter. Okay, let's hold that aside for a second. Seriously, with becoming modesty, briefly and reasonably, this is how we're supposed to speak, but without raising one's voice. As it is written, a wise man is known by his few words, which is probably why I should begin to wrap this up here soon. But the general concern here seems to be with frivolity. So I would hope, and maybe Benedict didn't have a very good sense of humor. I don't know. But I'm certainly not going to say here whether he meant it or not. I'm not going to say that we shouldn't have a sense of humor. I'm going to be a big advocate for humor. But I would agree that frivolity, there can be a lot of humor, as Joan Chittister said, is not funny. Everything we laugh at is not funny. And so in this spirit of humility, let's be careful. Again, be careful how we live, the scripture says. The final step in Benedict's ladder is that we should always manifest humility in our bearing, no less than our hearts. That's a great sentence. Always manifest humility in our bearing, how we carry ourselves, no less than in our hearts. Yes, in our hearts, not just with our lips. So that, Benedict says, it's evident. So that the humility is actually evident at the work of God, which the work of God in Benedict's rule is the divine office, the praying of the hours throughout the day. So in the oratory at church, but also throughout the monastery, the community, or the garden, on a journey, or in the field, or anywhere else. He covers all the bases. No matter basically wherever we are, we should be carrying a bearing of humility. He specifically says heads bowed and eyes cast down. And so if you do visit the monastery, when the monks don't just run around. Heads bowed, eyes cast down. John Cassian, he was a monk 100 years before Benedict, wrote that the way one sits, stands, walks, and bows all speak with more eloquence than words. We can see humility in others, can't we? In just the way they carry themselves. Once again, please don't take this in some legalistic sense that your head needs to be bowed and you need to walk with your eyes down at the ground. But don't just talk about being humble. Always manifest humility in our bearing, no less than our hearts, so that it is evident wherever we go. As I wrap this up, Dennis Ockholm, in his book about what we can learn from the monks today, he writes that this is where the Benedictine vow of stability comes into play, and I couldn't agree with him more. He says that by remaining in the same community day after day, we are nearly forced to become humble. For I cannot continue to wear the mask that hides my true self if I'm with the same people on a regular basis. Parenthetically, he then says, said differently, church hopping is a useful practice if you want to nurture your pride. Once again, that's the spirit of this whole series. These standing and looking around and asking for the ancient road. It's not about becoming a monk. But there are some ancient ways, some ancient practices of cultivating lives of quietness and solitude and prayer, in living lives in community with each other over the long haul, in having a proper attitude to the chores of life and the work we do and the vocations that we live out, the callings that we live into. About praying for and striving for lives of humility. Romans 12:10 says, honor one another above yourselves. The Contemporary English Bible, the CEB version, says, be the best at showing honor to each other. I love that idea. Be the best at being humble. It's what Benedict calls good zeal. So I'd like to read the whole, it's not long, but toward the end of Benedict's rule. In chapter 72, he has a little chapter he calls the good zeal of monks. And hear what he says here. Just as there is a wicked zeal of bitterness, which separates from God and leads to hell, so there is a good zeal, which separates from evil and leads to God and everlasting life. This then is the good zeal, which monks must foster with fervent love. And quoting Romans 12:10, he says, they should each try to be the first to show respect to the other, supporting with the greatest patience one another's weaknesses of body or behavior, and earnestly competing in obedience to one another. No one is to pursue what he judges better for himself, but instead what he judges better for someone else. To their fellow monks, they show the pure love of brothers. To God, loving fear, reverence. To their abbot, unfeigned and humble love. Let them prefer nothing whatever to Christ. And may he bring us all together to everlasting life. Right prior to that, Benedict writes of mutual obedience. He says, obedience is a blessing to be shown by all, not only to the abbot, but also to one another, since we know that it is by this way of obedience that we go to God. He will finish that chapter saying, anyone who refuses to do this, if they are stubborn, should be expelled from the monastery. It's that important. Obedience, humility, submission. From time to time, I like to point out this familiar text in Ephesians. You know, there's many people go off and they make a big deal out of Ephesians 5:22 about wives submitting to their husbands. And then a lot of people go and make a big deal about how much they don't like that verse. But it's so often, most often, just purely misunderstood and taken out of context. Because it's simply a sentence in a long litany of sentences that comes under the heading of Ephesians 5:21, which says that we're all to submit to everyone else. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. That's what Benedict was saying. It's not just to the abbot. We should all be mutually obedient and submissive to each other. It's what Paul says to the Ephesians. He had started in the 5th chapter, what we call chapter 5 of Ephesians, follow God's example, walk in the way of love, find out what pleases the Lord, be filled with the Spirit, and submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. You see, humility, when you get down to it, I've always loved this definition. It's simply seeing yourself as God sees you, which is not as some inferior, lowly object. No, God sees you, God sees me as the beloved. And once we recognize who we are in God's eyes, it then frees us up to truly be the humble people that we are called to be. Richard Rohr says it this way: it's a gift to joyfully recognize and accept our own smallness and ordinariness, because then we're free with nothing to live up to, nothing to prove, nothing to protect. Such freedom, he says, is my best description of Christian maturity. Because once you know that your I, letter I, me, your I is great and one with God, you can ironically be quite content with a small and ordinary I. No grandstanding is necessary. Any question of your own importance or dignity has already been resolved once and for all and forever. And so we can circle all the way back to Micah 6:8, where we started this morning, and walk humbly. Some of you might have seen my reposting of Brian Zahn's translation of Micah 6:8. Brian Zahn is a pastor in Colorado that I like, and he quoted Micah 6:8 from the BZV, the Brian Zahn version. And it simply said, come on, man. God has told you what to do. Do justice and set wrongs right. Love mercy and let go of the meanness. Walk humbly with God and quit goose-stepping with the devil. Invite you to go out with this closing song of humility, one where we fall down before Almighty God, where we bow down in submission to God, in submission, mutual submission to each other, laying our crowns, taking them off, and laying them at the feet of Jesus, and walk humbly with our God and with each other. Go in the grace of God this week. Amen.